You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we welcome Michelle Rogers back to the podcast. For those of you who are new listeners, Michelle appeared in two of our previous episodes. In episode 108, we talked about potty training. In episode 112, spoke about communication skills and building those communication skills. On today's episode, I think we're going to hit the trifecta. So Michelle is here to talk about behavioral issues, more specifically severe behaviors. This topic is crucial for parents of autistic children to understand because they greatly affect the quality of life for both the child and the family. Through her own experience as a mother with autistic child, Michelle's gained valuable insight into the challenges faced by many families, and she has not only helped her own daughter thrive, but also hundreds of mothers and their autistic children through advocacy work and extensive knowledge in the field. Michelle, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me again.
It's my pleasure. It's always fun to be able to talk just because it really brings in the parental perspective. And as a field, if we're not doing that and engaging regularly with parents and other stakeholders, we're probably not doing things right. So I do appreciate you coming in. And if I'm correct, this is the third part of the core teaching that you do. Am I right?
Correct. So I have this philosophy that I share with all of my families that says that I want you to be working on the big three. And these are the three life skills that I believe all children on the spectrum, no matter how severe their autism symptoms present, need for a chance at an independent life. And the first one is potty training. The second one is communication. And the third one is reduced problem behavior or zero problem behavior. And the reason I want that is because I want them to be able to sit and attend and learn in school.
And absolutely. And oftentimes these are safety behaviors. And these are things that as parents is that we probably have the most trepidation and fear of is, am I putting my child in a situation where they could injure themselves? They could injure others. They could engage spontaneously in something that maybe puts them in harm's way. But can you give me just a little bit of background before we hop into that? Not everybody has heard all the episodes you've been a part of, but maybe you can tell us just a little bit about how your child has shaped or influenced your approach towards treatment and care over the years.
Sure. So my daughter Juliana, she was my first. She was diagnosed on the spectrum at age 2. There were definite signs. In hindsight, you can always see things clearer than when you were in the thick of it. And I was in straight up denial. I believed that she was just kind of developing in her own time, but there were just some really clear red flags when I think back to it now. She had language, she had some language and lost it. I remember feeling like a black cloud had kind of just traveled over her head suddenly around 13 months. And I remember even saying to my mom, where did my happy baby go? She started to, she drooled when she was teething, but then all of a sudden it stopped. And then all of a sudden I was buying bibs by the boatload. She was drooling nonstop. Like it was just constant drool coming out of her mouth. And then she, instead of playing with her toys, she would dump them out of her toy bin and she'd just start twisting them in her hands with like not using it for its intended purpose. And I was still in denial, believe it or not. You see all this and I'm like, no, I think that, everyone's just overanalyzing and overthinking this. And finally, I guess a family member that was out of town had come in to visit and said, wow, she's really quiet. Like she's not talking. And I was like, oh, all right, I'm hearing it. I'm like, fine, I'm just going to get an evaluation. I'm going to see, what's going to happen and just prove everybody wrong. And immediately they came in and she was probably about 22 months at this time. And I was pregnant with my son. I was very pregnant. So I was about 8 months pregnant with him. And they said, she's not behind. She's definitely behind, but too young to diagnose because she wasn't 2 yet. And I'm like, diagnosed for what? I was still so like completely had no idea what they were talking about. And they said, it seems like we're going to give you some speech and we're going to give you some special ed sessions, but if it seems like she's not getting better, then call us back in. And I remember being so angry after he left. I'm like, you're never going to see me again. I totally disagree with everything you're saying. Complete denial. I was on the complete denial train. And over the next couple of months, it actually did start to get worse, and people were questioning it. And I remember I'd already had her enrolled in a regular preschool, like a nursery school. And within a week, I started getting the calls every day that she was having a hard time settling down, trying to get emotional. She had a hard time following directions. And then we went for her wellness visit a month late. She was, I think it was at the end of November, a couple weeks late of her second birthday. And I'd asked the doctor, the pediatrician there, and I said, everyone's saying she's behind, but look at her, right? She's not behind. I was still in denial with all of this going on. And he said, well, is she using 20 words with intent? And I said, no. And he's like, well, then she's definitely behind. And there was something about him saying it after hearing all of the people and the teacher at her nursery school. It was like a gut punch to me. And it was finally the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, like maybe something is wrong here. And I did have that person I swore I'd never see again back in my home. And she was officially diagnosed on the spectrum, moderate to severe. So yeah, so I understand exactly what parents that are listening right now are going through. I know exactly what it's like to feel like I died that day, and I felt like autism was a death sentence. And I thought that for a while. And I remember having this thought one day. I woke up and I said, I'm going to die one day, and who's going to care for her when I'm gone? And something about that thought, even though it's kind of scary, just really snapped me into my action. I said, listen, I always promised before autism came that I was going to show up as a certain type of parent. And as soon as the diagnosis came, that kind of went out the window. And I need to know that one day when I do leave this earth, that I've left no stone unturned for her, that I've shown up exactly as I promised I would be before the diagnosis came. And I didn't know by making that definitive course correction, that I was going to get the results I did get with her. I just knew that I could have peace in my heart that I had shown up for her. And just to give you a quick update on Juliana lost all of her language. We had to teach her sign language. She started making sounds, started repeating, speaking. She went from the most restrictive special education preschool. She was in the 614, the most restrictive one you could be in. It was an autism class, to where she is today. She is now 10 years old, thriving. This is her first year in a general education classroom. We were in integrated up until this point, which I loved. I didn't even hate integrated. I loved it. And they said to us last year at our IEP meeting, Mrs. Rogers, try not to cry, I think she's ready. I'm sorry, but you just never, if I thought about where I was when I was checked out and thought this was this death sentence, that we were able to have a meeting like this last year, I would have never believed you, and this is what's possible for all babies, possible for all families. But you have to kind of get right in your mind to take the action from somebody who believes versus somebody who disbelieves.
Yeah. And to be honest, is that you should never apologize for having tears of pride is the way that I'd be looking at this. The tears of anything, you should never have to apologize. But I mean, I could see in your face how proud you were of your daughter's accomplishments and the fact that she has been able to establish so many skills, and you guys did that journey together. Yes. Which is amazing, and the amount of effort that everybody's been putting in throughout the process. But you had mentioned something, and you had spoken about different behaviors that kind of indicated that something was going on. And maybe this is where I'd love to be able to start our conversation today, is that problem behavior is defined so differently depending on who you're talking to. And it's also defined differently. Even for the neurotypical population, it's defined so differently, and what you target and what you're going to work on. When I look at my daughter, is that my daughter really wants to be an athlete. One thing that keeps her back from doing that is surprisingly nail biting, because it takes her attention away from what she's doing when she's out on the field. She's so engaged in biting her nails. Thus, it's a problem behavior. Would I care about her nail biting if it wasn't causing her any sort of problems throughout the rest of her day or to her goals in her own life? Probably not. But because it's interfering with her personal goals, to me, that is the biggest problem behavior in the world. As a parent, it's like, well, we got to fix this. Let's take a step back. Let's figure out how we can work through this so that you're not missing out on what's prideful for you. So, how do you, as a mother, and you went through it with a young child where they probably couldn't articulate their goals, how did you identify problem behaviors? And for those not watching, it's air quotes, but I mean, it's how did you identify what those sticky behaviors were?
So I think you made a good point in that, like, problem behavior is really defined to the person. And but I want to be really clear in exactly what he said, that the behaviors that his daughter was exhibiting, meaning the nail biting, isn't necessarily quote unquote a problem behavior, but it is a problem when it starts to infect her quality of life and her inability to get specific goals done. It's almost, I would even equate this sometimes to stimming. Now, I don't necessarily try to deter stimming. My daughter still stims, but if the stimming became overwhelming to the point where she could not function in her day-to-day life, then that now becomes a problem behavior. I want to be very clear on the distinction of those two. So in the example I was just discussing, which is our story, and a lot of people, this is why problem behavior needs to be so clearly defined in your mind as a behavior that is impeding on the potential quality of life for the family and for the child. This is where it kind of opens everything up, because could I handle a crying, tantruming child who would cry every time I go to the pantry, and every time I try and figure out what she wanted, she'd smack it out of my hand? Could I survive with a 2-year-old doing that? Absolutely. But the problem with that is that it's not teaching her we're not looking at the cause of the behavior. One of the big things about my program and what we talk about is we need to understand the function of the behavior to create the solve. And I want to think about, yeah, it's, I can deal with it, maybe a crying 2-year-old, but could I deal with a 7-year-old or 10-year-old or a 15-year-old smacking things out of my hands? Will that behavior look the same, or could it actually look worse if we leave it untreated? So that's kind of like my perspective from what I shared. So yeah, she was crying a lot, and it's terrible to hear your baby cry, but like sometimes if I'm not describing problem behavior as impeding on quality of life, I might take more of it. And then I sprinkle a little autism diagnosis on top of that. I'm almost expecting to have to deal with this. But if I
Yeah.
have that expectation and I never address this as a problem behavior, the only outcome that's possible is for it to get worse.
Hmm. No, and I think that the insight that you have as you're looking through that to be able to say, what is going to be equally valuable for my child? What's functional for them to be able to do to replace what's occurring becomes the most important question. Is that a crying child is a crying child. They're emotionally distraught for some reason. And if we're not figuring that out, then we might be in a bad position when we're solving. We might get rid of crying. Crying might then turn into a punch. A punch might turn into something even more dangerous because we haven't solved to why that is occurring and what purpose the crying's doing. So, what strategies, as you worked through this, and I mean, you've had your personal experience, you're helping other families to kind of unwind the process. What strategies did you find most successful in addressing some of these issues?
So the first thing we need to do is I like to put space between the incident and myself so I can look at it with clarity. I always say to my moms when they come to me with whatever they're working on, whether it be pie training, communication, or problem behaviors, and they're seeing things they don't like and it's triggering emotions in them, I can't look at it clearly when I'm rolling around in the dirt in the moment right then and there. So what I first thing I always try to do with problem behaviors is I always try to avoid. I used to call it the autism mom bomb squad method, meaning we want to avoid the bomb from going off to begin with. That's the first thing, right? So we want to try and avoid the behavior from happening to begin with. If it's something really problematic, like running in the street or eloping or biting, we got to immediately figure out what the cause is and then try and avoid it from happening in the first place. That's number one. Like, what are the triggers that may cause this behavior to happen? So that's first. Then the next thing is if the behavior happens, because sometimes it's just going to happen. Maybe thought that you had removed all the stimuluses that could cause a child to bite and they bit anyway. I need you to take a deep breath and kind of put some space between yourself and the incident so that you can see it from the drone view. I always tell my parents, you can never see it from the drone view when you're in the middle of it. You have to almost like take some space, calm your regular, your nervous system, so that way you can look at this and say, okay, what was the cause of the bite? You know what I mean? And then once I understand the cause, then I can come up with a game plan for the solve. And there's something in the ABA world, and I'm sure Jeff can knows all about inside and out, is the MEETS, which is an acronym for the reasons that unwanted behaviors occur in children with autism, or actually all children, to be honest with you. Any child that's exhibiting problem behavior, there is one of 5 categories for the function of why that is happening. Did you
Yeah,
want
and
to share, or you want me to share what that is?
I mean, we can definitely go into, because I mean, we're probably going to want to hit on each one of these functions individually, but you had brought up a topic that I think that oftentimes we as parents fall into pitfalls for. It's the idea that whenever a behavior occurs, is that at the moment it's always a teachable moment, or we always have to win that power struggle. And it's not the case. I mean, there are times where I'm not ready as a parent to work through it appropriately.
Yep.
B, my child is not ready to learn that new skill yet. So what do you suggest at those moments? I mean, do you have certain things that have worked for you just to de-escalate, just to say, you know what, I'm not going to teach right now. I'm going to escape the situation right now. And that is my only goal at the moment. I can get to the teaching later. But do
Yes.
you have techniques for that?
So the first thing you want to do is, obviously, safety is number one. So if the child runs in the street, you want to try and address that. First thing we're going to do is obviously bring the child and yourself to safety. If the child's being aggressive, we want to try and put some safeguards in place to stop the aggression. If somebody's getting hurt, whatever the case may be, safety is always going to be your first. We got to get to a safe space mentally, emotionally, physically, before we can do anything. That's number one. Number one is we want to try and use any skills that we may already have from dealing with these behaviors in the past to calm the child down. Like if it's gotten to a point where the bomb has blown, this isn't a teachable moment. The teachable moment will come later. The teachable moment is the actual event, but we don't teach in that moment. It's just the child's not on receive, and you're really not on a proper send to give a message to the child. So we want to get the child probably as neutral as possible. It may take some time to calm them down. Then after that happens and we've kind of regulated the child, I need you to go off and kind of just take a minute for yourself. I don't believe in fails as a parent of a child with autism. I'm either learning or I'm winning. And that incident, although uncomfortable as it may be, there's so much that I could learn from this if I can give myself the space to just have my own little heal, my own little cry about it, punch a pillow, whatever it's going to look like, so that when time has separated the event from me, I can actually look at it from an objective standpoint, which is like the drone view that I talk about.
I
So
think I mean, just going back to the two things that you just kind of hit on there, it's the idea is that you're either learning or you're meeting the goal. That's a win-win. I mean, as a
always,
parent, we don't have win-wins that often. That's
yes,
such a cool perspective to take. I mean, and it's probably hard to get in that mindset when you're working with families on this. How much do you have to really hammer home that, you know, learning is a win? Like you don't have to feel like you have control all the time to be doing a wonderful job. I think we're hard on ourselves.
yes.
But how do you work through that process to get to, and we'll talk on all the functions of
Yeah.
behaviors and everything, but how do you get to that emotional part?
So I guess what I always do with them is I show them back the data they presented to me. So they'll present you'll know we have brains that are very dramatic in the way they create thoughts to keep us safe. And most of the thoughts are pretty toxic. And it's not like your brain's trying to make you live this miserable life. It believes I need to present you thoughts that scare the shit out of you so that I keep you safe. So like I would have a parent, right? And this is an example that had happened. They went camping and it was later in the day, and the child was up on top of a slide and there was a little baby up there too. And he pushed the baby off the top and the baby fell. And all the mother could say to me is that the baby's face hit the rocks. This is all I kept saying. Now, thank God the baby was fine. It was just, a terrible accident that happened. The child pushed the baby might have been in his way. What we ended up discovering from it is that all she could see in that moment was just the baby's face keep hitting the rocks, hitting the rocks. And that's not helpful. That all that does is make you feel like shit. All that does is you can't learn anything from this. So if we want to prevent him from behaving like this in the future, I can't create a solve from just reliving the most traumatic part of the event over and over. So what I did with that mom is I said, this was very traumatic. I'm not even not acknowledging that it wasn't. And I'm so grateful that the baby and the child, everybody was okay. But what can I learn from this scenario to avoid it from that caused it and that could avoid it from happening in the future? And one of the things that we did discover, and I had her explain the whole day up until that point, and it was a very long day for this child. And this child normally naps, and he didn't, and there was a lot of stimulus. And by that time in the day, he was probably very tired. And when a child is tired, neurotypical, neurodiverse, they will not be the happiest of campers and their behaviors will show it. And we kind of both acknowledged that maybe we pushed it a little bit on this day of camping. And had I not pushed it, and will I not push it in the future, I could potentially avoid something like this from happening. And that's where I want to show you your thoughts. Like, listen, all her brain wanted to do was keep giving her the visual of the baby falling. That's not helpful. If you want to really help your child to avoid doing something like this in the future, I need to understand why it happened so I can create the solve for it.
Absolutely. And oftentimes our response to those situations themselves is that if we're not going into it calmly,
Yeah.
then we're inadvertently potentially reinforcing something that maybe we didn't want to. Maybe when that child was pushed is that we immediately went to the wrong child and started giving all the attention to them. And um, maybe that's what that particular child was looking for at the time was, maybe they were looking for attention and we gave it. We gave it in some format there. What is it? So when we're talking and we spoke about the functions of behavior and I think that the idea of being calm, the idea of not always having to win, the idea of being deliberate in our responses is so important. But as we talk about those functions, and I mean, we spoke about attention. There's also that kind of that access, the ability to be able to get what it is from the environment that you want at any given time. There's the escape function of, can I get out of it? Whatever is happening right now, all I'm trying to do is withdraw from it. I just don't want this occurring anymore. Is there something going on there? There's that automatic, the sensory component, which we have to be aware of. There's also a piece of it that's just counter control. It's it's a function not often talked about, but it's just the ability of a child, like adults, to want to control their environment to the max extent. And even if they know that they don't want something at a given time, or maybe they do want it, but control is so much more powerful, is that they're still going to want that control of the environment more than anything else. But as you're working through these don't work in isolation. Functions often intermingle. So for a parent to work through that and understand exactly why somebody wants or why a child's responding, how do you help them to ascertain that? You mentioned data. Is that your first step is, let's just start understanding it before we intervene on it?
Yeah. So first thing I want to say is like the knee-jerk reaction to that example I gave is to freak out. I get that. It's not necessarily trying to control that part of your response. It's how you move forward after that. She could say, we're never going camping again. And how does that solve for his behavior? It doesn't. It's just, it solves for my fear that I don't ever want to be in a position where he's going to push a child off of a swing set. You understand what I'm saying? So that's the first part of it. Then what I try to do, the space between you and the event is so crucial because you can be you're more objective and less emotional when there's some space between. So then what I like to do is, and I'm sure Jeff knows, this is the ABC. I'm not formally trained in ABA, by the way. This has just been a part of my life. It's in my DNA now because this is everything I've ever been exposed to. It's called the ABCs of an event or a behavior. So the first one is the antecedent. That's the A. That's what happened before the incident. the B is the actual behavior itself. What did it look like? And then C is the consequence, what happened right after. So what I do is I really just ask them, tell me the ABC of it, what exactly happened before, and then I ask questions if I'm not clear, what the actual behavior looked like, and then what happens immediately after it. And listen, there's no, Jeff is right. There could be multiple functions for a specific behavior, or I could think it's attention seeking, but then as I ask questions or we implement a system, assuming it's attention seeking, that's wrong, then we can go back and say, okay, let's look at it again. Maybe it was escape and avoidance, and I had it wrong. There's no wrong with this. There's no fails with this. We're always trying. We're learning until we win every time. So yeah, so that's how I do it. We basically go through the scenario, go through the incident. I ask for the ABCs of it, and they can start seeing it themselves. Like all of a sudden, they can move away from the drama of their brain just bringing them to the worst part of the incident every single time they think about it, and they can start looking at the data of what actually happened.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to collect that data, and I understand from a parental perspective, you have so many things going on. But having that information, like any decision going on in your life, whether it's a financial decision, whether it's a big business decision, you need to have actionable data to be able to do it correctly. So I do emphasize that's so important, and don't ever think that I'm just going through the process of tally marks or whatever it may
Yeah, it's
be.
not like that. Exactly. Not for me anyway. I do tally marks and stuff like that for like toilet training, but I don't necessarily do that specific to these events. It's really just like what happened before, what did it look like when they did it, what happened after.
Mhm. And as much as that you can get, that I mean, the more informed you are and the better decision making. You actually said something that maybe I don't think about enough. Um, and it had to do with the context of the story that you shared and the potential parental response of, well, we're never going camping.
Yeah.
There's always going to be kind of that co-occurring behavioral dependency. You're going to have the behavior of a family member or a parent or an intervener that is occurring at the same time, and they're going to have a function of their behavior in natural life occurring at the same time as the child.
Yes, that's
How
right.
important is self-awareness in the process of intervening in all of this? Because I could see, I mean, if I go back and reflect on my own life, I've probably failed at this all the time. So, I mean, it's like, how important is it to take a step back, deep breath? Okay, where am I right now? What function am I trying to fulfill as I'm trying to help my child at the same time? I mean, do you work with family on, maybe it's important to assess ourselves and our own behavioral objectives?
This is what I say. My program, I have a group coaching program where I coach parents of children with autism and help them teach your children all the amazing important life skills like the pie train, the communication, stopping problem behaviors. But 95% of my program is your thoughts. That literally the tactical you already have inside you, but because you're having all of these, like I always say, the mind is like a furnace, and this isn't my quote, but it's I read it somewhere and I loved it. The mind is like a furnace; it can warm your house or burn it down. And all of the tactical that's needed to get your child potty training and communicating and stopping problem behaviors is inside you already. You just have really shitty thoughts that are blocking your ability to access those resources. So I have it. I'm
Mhm.
going to give it to you. I know what I'm telling you is not something you haven't already heard. What I'm going to show you that you haven't heard, that nobody ever really talks about enough in this community, is that your thoughts, whether it be autism is cancer. I talked to a mom the other day. She was doing all the things I would tell her to do in my program, except she said to me that she believed her child was going to need lifetime care. He was 3 years old. You can't help your child if you already think that the opportunity's gone.
Yeah.
And that's like, believe it or not, we give them all tactical, we give them lots of tactical support. I sell them what they want, but when they come in, I give them what they need, because it's really the thoughts that we're letting run rampant. It's like a toddler running around with scissors in your brain. And I need to stop that shit in its tracks. I need to understand like the power that has. If I always call it the invisible umbilical cord for my moms, right? That it's garbage in, garbage out to the baby.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you start thinking something different, like I did that moment when I said, I'm going to die one day, who's going to care for when I'm gone? That was my course correction, that thought in that moment, that I want to know that I leave tomorrow, and I did everything I could. I showed up the best way I could for my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Know what that was going to do for her actual development.
Yeah,
Had that not happened, I don't know where she would be today.
absolutely. And I mean, just to go back to how we started this conversation, is that that hope paid off. I mean, and everybody's journey will be different, and people will have different timelines and different wins. But it's knowing that, you're going to hit wins that you never thought were going to be part of your experience,
Yeah.
as long as you continue to look at, what's next. What can I continue to do? I have a question for you, because I mean, you talk about that communicative part, and that was a whole other episode we talked about. One of the things that, and I guess it's a passion project of mine right now, is the fact that we have, as a community, started to give voice to those in the autism community who can voice their own opinions, and voice their own needs, and voice and advocate on their own behalf. The group that we might not be hitting all the time in empowering that voice are those that maybe don't have the voice yet, or are communicating differently. And that shows up in behavior often. So when you're talking about, how do I effectively communicate, build relationship, understand what's being communicated to me during extreme behaviors, how do you work with families to kind of not disempower the child by taking away their only ability to communicate frustration or anger, but to see that that's there, respect it, and still intervene at the same time? Like, where's that juxtaposition occur?
So my belief is about 9 times out of 10, a problem behavior exists in a child because they are frustrated. They can't communicate want and needs. So if we're seeing this all over the place, it's the first thing we work on. Like, I need to get that child an ability to communicate. And this is the thing, and we talked about this on that last podcast, communication and being verbal are not the same things. And that's a good thing. We can communicate in other ways first, and then verbal language can come. So if I always have a vision of a thought on one side of a wall and a voice on the other side, and if I imagine a neural pathway connecting the two, it's like it's dormant, like it's asleep. I need to create a bridge form of communication, so that child can immediately get their wants and needs met. When Juliana learned sign language, she learned cookie by the end of the first day. I couldn't believe it, how fast she learned it. And then she ended up learning 10 signs within a week. Her problem behavior, which was constant tantruming, instantly stopped. That cloud that I saw come over my child at 13 months, gone in less than a week, because she could express herself with her hands.
Yeah.
And I had no idea if she'd ever speak. I didn't know. All I knew is she was happier than she was a week ago. And this
Mm-hmm.
is what's possible for all of our babies. So yeah, so when we're dealing with this, we don't want to not like, we're not going to try. It's not like whack-a-mole. We're just going to whack it, and then another problem's going to pop. Another problem behavior is going to pop up somewhere else. The idea here is to give them an appropriate way to express themselves while we're starting to build on the ability to have vocal language.
Yeah, and I think that that's the first step to empowerment in general, is to give a voice. And I think that we've all learned this over time, or we're all learning it over time. But at the same time, is that I think that there is value in, when you're starting the process of behavior change, is to understand that, protest behavior is communicative.
Right.
And my first goal for anybody to get them into that learning situation that we talked about earlier is, I have to have a willing partner here. Like, I have to have somebody who's assenting to the fact that they want to be a part of the environment I'm creating,
Yes.
in order to help them to learn the new skills that are going to empower all their other skills in life. So when you start this process with either when you start it with your daughter, or when you are helping other families, instead of jumping 2 feet into the pool and saying, all right, we're doing it all, what is the importance that you see in establishing a new relationship around wanting to be a part of that environment together before you even start the work?
So I guess what I always tell my families when they come in, I say, okay, what are the things you want to work on? They'll have a full list. And I'll say, okay, what out of all these skills would improve quality of life for the family and for the child if I could wave a magic wand and give it to you? And then that usually it's either potty training or communication, because I think there is an underlying understanding that the problem behaviors a lot of times exist because I'm frustrated. So yeah, and then we'll start working from there, and then we work on one master. I always say we major in one, we minor in the other, right? So while we're majoring in maybe teaching sign language, we're minoring in getting the child just be okay with sitting on the potty. See what I'm saying? And then we can, this is how it's always worked with Juliana, is that we've always have like this major focus, which right now for us is social skills, but I'm minoring in picky eating. See what I'm saying? So then I always move, and everything, and all the priorities can move around and shift as time goes on. As she gets older and age appropriate problems may arise, we can always shift and adapt and pivot. And that's kind of just how I run the program and how I teach parents how to teach their children all these life skills. Because this is not just a one and done. We're parents till they're 18. We're really parents until we're gone. Let's be real. She's going to be my baby even when she's 40 or 50 years old and I'm in a wheelchair. But I tend to be as active a part of her life as possible. And I always had this identity of before the diagnosis that I was going to be a mother that brought up children that are going to make this world like going to be such a strong, wonderful contributor to the world after I'm gone. And that's still the intent I have.
Mm-hmm.
My dying breath, even after she's 18 and out of the house.
I was going to say, it sounds like she's already hitting those strides.
Yes.
So.
Juliana talks. She's got friends. She goes to sleepovers. She is doing amazing. She's on a swim team, and that almost never happened. She pooped in the pool 5 weeks straight. I almost quit, and that's just her mom was like, I may not go camping again. We're never going to swim lessons again because she kept pooping in the pool. But I had to put space between myself and the incident. Oh, okay, this is why it's happening. Create the solve, and now she's on a swim team.
Oh, that's so awesome. And I think in a future episode, we're definitely going to have to talk about the picky eating, but I do want to make sure that families leave with some ideas on resources. I know that you've put together some resources on this that you'll be able to share with us, but where should families be turning to just to even start the journey on some of the behavior issues that are occurring? What's a good resource you'd recommend?
I'm going to be sharing with Jeff the Autism Mom Survival Guide to Problem Behaviors. It's an e-guide, a PDF I created that's really going to take you to step by step on how to address these behaviors. First thing we're going to try and do is avoid them, figure out what are the triggers and avoid them first. And then we're going to work one by one on each of these behaviors to figure out why they're happening so that we can create a solve. So I'm going to give that guide to all of the listeners for free. You will also be able to find it on our website at michellebrodgers.com, and I'm on Instagram at michellebrodgers.
Well, thanks again, Michelle. I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you sharing your daughter's experiences. I think that it's just always eye-opening, and being able to talk just openly and honestly between clinician and parent, it for me, it's a pleasure. So I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get you back on to talk about picky eating.
Yes, it's been always a pleasure to speak with you, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.